Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. So tonight's topic is a variation on drugs, sex, and rock and roll. So hope you enjoy it. This talk is on wise actions or ethical actions. So I'll be talking about killing, stealing, drugs, and sex. Or actually abstaining from those. Every tradition that values transformation or developing consciousness, being more aware, being more awake, has some form of ethical guidelines. We have the 10 Commandments. In yoga, we have the yamas and niyamas. In the Buddhist tradition, we have sila. And these are basically the riverbanks for your behavior that help you to stay focused on what's most important. There's a lot of variation in how these teachings are articulated, all the way from thou shalt not to, on the other hand, descriptions of wakefulness. An awakened person doesn't kill. An awakened person doesn't steal. So it's a description of consciousness in a sense. There's quite a spectrum of attitudes toward ethical behavior, ranging from kind of extreme fundamentalism, which basically says if you disagree with a word of what I say, you are my enemy, to a much more nuanced awareness of how to navigate through this complex life, this complex society, and to be as ethically in alignment with your intention as possible. When you take a traditional Vipassana retreat, kind of a classical orthodox retreat in the Buddhist tradition, in the very beginning of the retreat, you go through some rituals. And some of them are highly ritualized. Some of them are more of like a Western tip of the hat. One of the rituals you go through is taking refuge. And that is, it's acknowledging that when you feel lost, when you feel stuck, when you feel hopeless, it's remembering the refuge of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Taking refuge in awareness, wakefulness, taking refuge in what's true, and taking refuge in the community or taking refuge in love. You also take the 5 precepts that every monk lives by, 5 precepts minimally, and then there are more precepts you can kind of add on if you want to be a little more focused. That is abstaining from killing, abstaining from doing harm with speech, which in a classical retreat is very, very easy because you're in silence the whole time. So that one's already kind of baked in. To abstain from stealing, from sexual harm, and abstaining from intoxicants. So I talked about wise speech last time, a couple of weeks ago. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to reflect on these other 4. And that is the undertaking the training of abstaining from killing, undertaking the training to abstain from stealing, undertaking the training to abstain from sexual harm, and undertaking the training to abstain from intoxicants. So the first, undertaking the training to abstain from killing. What exactly does that mean? Does it mean humans, animals, any living thing? I was on my first retreat with Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who's from the Tibetan tradition. He was talking about I think he was talking about desire in one of his Dharma talks. And so he started talking about how much he just loved having a big yak steak. I thought, well, that's interesting. And, the Dalai Lama is a meat eater. And, of course, if you look at the Tibetan culture, living high in the mountains, there's not a lot to eat other than animals. So that's kind of a part of their culture. And, of course, they have sort of ritualized guidelines to make it as ethically pure as possible. But in that particular culture, in the Buddhist tradition, that meat is actually part of the culture. So it's not just abstaining from eating animals. And what each of these points to is, where is your set point? There's no question that as we do violence upon others, that affects us on some level. I was reading recently in the New York Times that in the first study of its kind, researchers with the Defense Department have found that pilots of drone aircraft experience mental health problems like depression, anxiety, and PTSD at the same rate as pilots of manned aircraft who are deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. So even with that remote distance from violence on others, it still has an effect on the psyche. So as we do harm, we experience it on some level. It's a very important reflection for each of us. And the question becomes, how could you do less suffering in the world? And where is your set point in that? And it gets very nuanced. Like, how far do you take it? And I don't think anyone takes it any further than the Jain monks. Have you ever seen the Jain monks who refuse to wear clothing because it's taking from others? They have a mask so they don't accidentally inhale any bugs and kill any bugs. And as they walk, they sweep in front of them so they remove anything that they might harm. There are other rules they live by. They can only eat as much as they can hold in one hand, and they can never stay anywhere more than one night. So that's part of their practice. That seems quite extreme. And I haven't met Jain monks, but I know when I lived in the ashram and those who would go to India, they're some of the happiest people in the world. So that's one extreme. And the other is for each of us living busy, committed lives. Where are we in that spectrum of doing harm? I grew up on a farm, and one of my earliest memories was maybe 6 years old, and I had the job when we would have dead lambs on the farm. I would carry them up onto the hill behind our farm and leave them out for the vultures. And I just remember very, very clearly, carrying the lambs and leaving them up there. And so meat was a big part of my father was a dedicated carnivore. His rule was he would only eat animals that were vegetarians. The joke at our table was, "Please pass Mary," So when I was in college, I found myself really missing the farm, and I got a job as a livestock manager for a really large. We ran both hogs and cash crops, so I was in charge of 500 hogs, and every 4 months we would have another 125 piglets, and so I was in charge of taking care of the piglets and castrating and doing all that stuff, and it was really fun to kind of make them as happy as I could until I had to deliver the barrows to market. When we would fill them out to about 220 pounds and take them to market. And remember the first time I did it, of these animals that I cared for, that was my job, backing the truck up where we would take them for them to be slaughtered, and to hear the screams in the slaughterhouse and to see the animals so freaked out and how they were just instantly sort of swept away by, as you can imagine, very unfeeling, uncaring people. I remember that feeling of what an ache it was to see how frightened the animals were. At that time, I was vegetarian, and we went through all kinds of machinations to make it okay that we were doing what we were doing, but it's really how we kept the farm alive. A few years ago, I found myself eating less and less meat, and so was Tara, and we decided, hey, let's have a rule. Let's have the house be vegan or vegan. Eggs are okay. But outside the house, anything goes. And quite quickly that fell away. So for the last couple of years, I have been eating a vegan lifestyle. And there are a number of things I love about it. I feel great. Absolutely, when you look closely at the impact of what it takes to support an animal culture, the effect on the planet is amazing. So, there's a movie called Cowspiracy, which is a fascinating thing to say, just the impact that has. But a large part of it for me is just that sense of not doing harm. And I don't say that with any self-righteous. I'm really not self-righteous about it at all. But that's where it is personally for me. Joseph Campbell said, he sort of like blew off vegetarianism when he said, how do you think a carrot feels when a vegetarian walks by? You know? Because it is all about eating and being eaten, of course. But it becomes a very important question. If you reflect on that precept of to refrain from killing, where does that register for you in your life? The other undertaking is the undertaking to abstain from stealing. And again, when you do a classical retreat, like these are the rules that help the community to move into a really undefended place of being sustained moment by moment by moment together. But it's a way that we can reflect on how we can live together as a culture as well. So to refrain from stealing means to only accept what is freely given. Again, there are gradations there. If you see the monks in Vietnam, when they go out for their alms, when they go out to beg for food, they wear very wide-brimmed hats. So when the begging bowl is presented to you, you cannot see the face of the monk. So it's designed to take away any sense of an ego doing something. So again, that's one way to push that all the way to the end. A number of years ago, when I was at Kripalu, I was in charge of our programming, and I was putting together a conference. And I contacted a guy by the name of Bo Lozoff. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book a long time ago called We're All Doing Time. It was about the ashram prison project. And he's since passed. But he had this vision of taking the teachings to those who are incarcerated, basically saying you're already living a monastic lifestyle. Do these practices. And really quite extraordinary what he did in the ashram prison project. So I called him to enroll him into this conference. And I told him what he would be paid and so forth. And he said, he was a pretty colorful guy. And he said a variation of, well, I'm really going to mess you up here. He said, I'm only going to come if I can do this with Donna. And I thought, well, bring her along. Who cares? I didn't say that. But the word dana is Pali for generosity. And the teachings in the Buddhist tradition are that the teachings are priceless, therefore there can be no charge. So they're offered freely. And generosity is encouraged. And that's part of the offering of this class, offered without any fee. No one is denied access. And your generosity supports me in what I do, along with supporting the church and IMCW, etc. And I was so intrigued by that. And his ashram, which is in North Carolina, which is now called Southern Dharma, it's now a really wonderful little retreat center in North Carolina. If you're interested in doing a retreat there, highly recommend it. He just talked about how relying on generosity and serving from fullness, what an exercise in faith it was for him. You know, there would be getting really, really low, and then there would be $1,000 check in the dana basket, and they would continue on. The practice of accepting only what is freely given is kind of comes back to one of those main intentions, which is to practice non-coveting, non-grasping. When I lived in West Africa in the Peace Corps, I could just see how the poverty was so extreme there. And I could just sort of see this hierarchy of desires, that those who had no shoes wanted shoes, and those who had shoes wanted a bicycle, and those who had bicycles wanted a moped, and the next level was a motorcycle, and the next level was a car, the next level was a bigger car, etc., etc. No different than our culture, but it was so stripped down there. I could just see the nature of mind. And of course, we're all subject to that. The constant strain of desire. The next thing that's going to make you feel good. That basic drive is what drives us into existence. So when we practice non-coveting, when we practice accepting what we're given, it becomes a very powerful precept. And of course, then it becomes a question of where in that spectrum are you? We all need to provide for ourselves. We want to provide for our families and for our loved ones. Can we do that in a way that can be in ethical alignment, where we're not taking from others, but perhaps using our generosity as a way to gain our livelihood? And I'll be doing another talk along this path, particularly on that subject, in a couple of weeks. So perhaps you can sense how in each one of these guidelines, there's nothing firm. That you have to really reflect on what is most in alignment for you. So the next reflection is abstaining from sexual harm. Whenever you go on a retreat, whenever you move into a spiritual community, generally you make a commitment to refrain from doing spiritual harm. And in some traditions, it's not uncommon to restrain from all sexual activity for a certain period of time. I did my 6.5 years. Paying attention to sexual energy is fascinating. It's been said, or at least what we would tell ourselves in the ashram when we were practicing celibacy, was that the halo around a saint's head was the sexual energy transformed. Kept us going. Whatever it took, man. But when you pay attention to sexual energy, of course, there's nothing good, nothing bad about it. It's just pure energy. Energy can be sexual, it can be spiritual, it can be on so many levels, but there is a profound quality of sexuality which can be jet fuel for your personal practice. And certainly it has taken us each down lots of different roads in our lives. There's a difference between our biological urges and our psychological urges. And by paying attention to that and sometimes refraining and looking at it closely can be very, very helpful, because you get lots of different distinctions around that energy, whether it's coming from biology, whether it's coming from a psychological element, from a quality of wanting, needing, etc., reinforcing a self-image, feeling okay about yourself. And it can be quite a humbling meditation to reflect on how you have used sex in your life. The harm that you may have done on others, the harm you may have experienced with others. It's a profound, profound inquiry that can sometimes open up real opportunities for forgiveness and loving kindness meditations. It's been said that when we do harm to ourselves or to others, we do it on 3 levels. The most subtle level is the level of thought, where our thoughts go. The next level is our speech, what we say. And the next level, maybe the grossest level, is our actions, what we actually do. So when you reflect on your sexuality and your sexual energy and sexual desire, it can be very interesting to just reflect on how does that show up in a level of thoughts. How does that show up through your speech? And how does it show up through your actions? There's nothing here about sexuality being bad, although different traditions certainly will take that stance, because it is such a powerful force. There's the classic meditations on which the Buddha taught on reflecting on the decaying body. And oftentimes monks were encouraged to practice it. And there are some sects who would use that SECTS. There are some sects that would use these meditations kind of as a way of sort of cultivating a sense of disdain for the body. There's a meditation on the kind of on the orifices, and it's all about cultivating a sense of real abhorrence for the body. But I don't feel that was the pure teaching. The real pure teaching was reflecting deeply on impermanence. When you reflect on sexual desire and you have an object of desire, to look very, very intimately at what is true, at what you are fixating on. If it is born out of causes and conditions, it is subject to change. It will fall away. It will get old. It will die. And pausing to reflect on that changes our relationship to our sexuality. From need and coveting and greed to holding it in a very, very different state, and one that can actually hold it very lightly and gently with a deep sense of celebration. The Buddhist teachings of Tantra are quite powerful. Georg Feuerstein is one of the great scholars in the West, talked about 2 kinds of Tantra. There's California Tantra, And then there's Tantra. We think of California Tantra as the kind of the ritual, sacred sex, and so forth. But the essence of Tantra is extraordinary. It's really about the merging of the male and female. How can you hold aliveness, full on bore aliveness, at the same time as you hold infinite space? And the practices are really quite extraordinary. So reflecting on sexuality, its power for cultivating deep intimacy and connection and aliveness, as well as the power to do great damage when it's driven by greed or hatred or delusion. And the final undertaking is undertaking the training to abstain from intoxicants. The purpose of our practice is to cultivate clear seeing. The word vipassana means to see clearly. But again, what does that mean in terms of your life and your practice? Does abstaining from intoxicants means no caffeine, no alcohol, no mood stabilizers for depression? I'm not so sure. Drugs have been part of our experience since the beginning of human nature, I think. And they have the capacity, just as with our sexuality, to provide deep insight into reality and to create great harm. And the only one who can figure out that balance is you. I had mentioned how in Johns Hopkins they are doing a study on the effect of high-dose psilocybin on long-term meditators. And they've done this study with those with terminal cancer and those with chronic addiction. And part of the inquiry is, what is the experience of high-dose psilocybin on consciousness for those who have a strong and steady meditation practice? It's a fascinating study. And if you are a long-term meditator and you're interested in that study, I'd be happy to talk with you. I had some experience of working on the design and also having gone through the experience. And again, what a beautiful reflection. It's sort of a mountaintop experience, but to look at it through this lens of the practice. For me, it was very, very helpful, very informative. For another, it may have been damaging. So reflecting on the use of chemicals in your life, how to find a way that is balancing for you. So it becomes a very interesting exploration. When you reflect on each of these, how do you find your way? There's a wonderful quote that I think really says it all. It says, so what is the test of truth? The Buddha offers a simple formula. Test things in terms of their cause and effect. Whatever is unskillful, leading to harm and ill, should be abandoned. Whatever is skillful, leading to happiness and peace, should be pursued. And this is one of the elements of this particular approach that I find so helpful. Personally, I hate anyone telling me what to do. Which is why so often, oftentimes people will make fun of how I lead meditation, because it's always, and if you like, you might consider, if it feels good. I'm much more the invitational approach as opposed to the this is the way you do it approach. At different times in our lives, we want tighter riverbanks. And that can be very, very helpful, where the choice is kind of taken away. Here's the straight and narrow, and you stay with it. And there are times in our lives where we respond to being more empowered to make choices for ourselves. And of course, that's a reflection on our culture. There are those in our culture who very much want to be told what is right and what is wrong. They very much want to have the system figured out, and you just do what you're told. And that's helpful. There's really nothing against that. But my personal sense is that life is much more nuanced than that. And that as you take responsibility for your practice and take responsibility for your life, and you really test that out, to try something on, try on any practice, whatever it is, ruthlessly evaluate, did this cultivate a more wholesome state or a less wholesome state? To me, then you're on that's an evolutionary practice, where you are practicing purely from what you sense is right. And of course, it's not just a solo path. When we are connected with others and we hear from others about their experiments and about what they're observing, that can also be deeply informative. So it's a wild ride. And these precepts can be helpful guidelines. I thought we might close with a little meditation and a reflection on these precepts. And then we'll break for cookies. So if you like, you can close your eyes. You might take in a nice, long, deep inhalation. And just relax and soften on the out-breath. I'm going to offer a very simple practice here for the next few minutes. I'm going to just offer one of these precepts, and you just have a minute or so just to reflect on your own. What does that mean for you? And to reflect on what you might fine-tune in your life, what's working, what you might adjust. And I'll phrase this in the words that you would as you were to head into retreat. I undertake the training to abstain from killing. And the second, I undertake the training to abstain from stealing, from what is not freely given. And the third, I undertake the training to abstain from harmful speech. And the fourth, I undertake the training to abstain from sexual harm. And the fifth, I undertake the training to abstain from intoxicants that might cloud my mind. And you might reflect in these final moments. Oftentimes, in the Asian tradition, they will use the word non to describe a certain state, and just sensing who you are, and practicing non-killing. Non-stealing. Non-harmful speech. Non-harming sexually. And non-intoxicated. The opposite of these, of cultivating life and connectedness. Of practicing generosity. Of being kind. Of cultivating wholesome intimacy. And seeing clearly into the nature of reality. In these final minutes, you might inquire what could soften, what could relax right now. If you were to release all desire for the next moment and simply be, what does that feel like? And you might now deepen your breath. In these final moments, you might bring into mind someone who might be struggling in their life right now. And just take a moment to let them know you're thinking of them, to wish them well. And sense this quality of the unbounded heart. And as you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And in your own time, you can let your eyes open. So thanks for your kind attention. So a little bit on ethical action. I always love that line, which I'm sure almost every one of us knows, of From the Unitarian perspective, how Moses came down with the 10 suggestions. And in that same way with the 5 precepts, we can interpret them as these rigid guidelines, or we can view them as these suggestions of possibility as we refine our hearts and our minds. Well, a couple of quick announcements, and then on to non-coveting cookie inquiry. There is something coming up called Mindful Life. You may have seen some advertisements for it. It's right here in town. 30 speakers, and it's April 28th through May 1st. And it's from the founders of the Mindful Leadership Summit. And it's going to be a very cool event. If you'd like to check that out, there are flyers back there. Also, if you'd like to be on the mailing list and you're not, you can sign up in the back. As always, thanks for your generous support that allows me to do what I do and supports the church and IMCW. And we're going to continue on with some of these explorations of the Eightfold Path.